Okay, and we are live. So I'm just going to double check this on LinkedIn to make sure that's working. Okay. Just so you know, there is a slight delay between what we say here and the actual live stream. So
okay.
It's not completely live.
For the sensors.
Okay, let's see here. Let's make sure that we're starting here. Okay. It's much slower today for some reason.
A lot of traffic.
Okay, I'm just gonna. Double check here. Sorry for the delay, Devin. I just want to make sure it should be working. I just don't see a preview on LinkedIn. But yeah, I think it's fine for us to just get started. Oh, it is working. Okay, amazing. Gotcha. All right. Sorry that took a second. But
these are all muscles. These are all muscles we've built since the pandemic anyway.
Right? Man, thank you for bearing with me there and everybody here in the chat. We have now validated this is live. So tech check is good. But I think we can just jump in, Devin.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
So hello, everybody. I'm Teague, your host of Design X BizDev with Foviate. And I'm here with Devin Liddell, Principal Futurist at Teague. For those of you who don't know, Teague is one of the most storied and famous industrial design firms. They've had one of the longest client-partner relationships ever with Boeing. So all the amazing planes that you've seen over the years from Boeing, Teague was part of that. And Devin's job as a principal design futurist is basically to think about the future and how design applies to it. Devin and I met many moons ago. At this point, I want to say like 3 years ago now. And Devin is an awesome mind who gets to think about, all the cool things about how technology is going to affect us, how design has to adapt and change, and how that gets applied in the real world. But Devin, I'll let you take it away and give a little bit about your backstory and about Teague as well.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, as a quick aside, by the way, even my kids don't fully believe that futurist is a real job. So
it's the best job.
It is a great job. But yeah, I have been a principal futurist at Teague. I'm coming up on my 15-year anniversary, like you mentioned. For those of you who don't know Teague, you covered some of it. We actually are celebrating our 100th year anniversary this year, which is pretty fun to celebrate a century of being in business. Founded by Walter Dorwin Teague, who essentially invented the whole practice and profession of industrial design. And as you touched on as well, we are also celebrating our 80th year anniversary of collaborating with Boeing. So that's an 80-year collaboration. It goes back to, if you can believe it or not, it goes back to the Boeing Stratocruiser, which predates the jet age. This was the aircraft that did not even, or that had propellers, right? So this is essentially a prop aircraft. And then at one point, I'll just say a little bit about Teague and touch on myself as well. Boeing Teague moved from New York City, where it was originally headquartered, to the Northwest to be closer to Boeing, real transparently. But there is an amazing image, and it's worth Googling if you'd like to, of what is essentially the 707 mock-up, and it's a full-scale mock-up of the Boeing 707, and it was built inside of a skyscraper in New York City. So even though it actually looks totally like the Boeing 707 and the interior of it, and it's often sort of cited as like, hey, this is the image of the Boeing 707. Sometimes it comes up in blogs around like what some people will call like the golden age of flying, but it's important to note that it's actually just a mock-up. It was mock-up inside of a skyscraper, like I mentioned. I joined Teague, just as a little bit of background about me. I joined Teague, as I said, 15 years ago. My background's in brand design. So prior to Teague, I worked for Fitch, which is now Landor, and was a director of brand strategy. And so I often bring, even to this day, still like a brand, what I would describe as like a brand lens to the future, to forecasting and foresight. Brands are actually a pretty good proxy, in my opinion, for like the future. In fact, that's often things that are like really popular as student work around like, hey, what does Microsoft's identity look like in 15 years time? And just even like small design explorations like that offer insights or takes or prognostications around like, hey, what do we think the future will look like? I've since shifted into foresight, strategic foresight. My title is really a futurist, even though I sometimes don't say that to all audiences. But for design fluent audiences, I absolutely do. And the easiest way to describe that role is actually through the lens of Boeing. So if you think about the task of designing and manufacturing an airframe, it takes roughly somewhere between 10 and 15 years. When you think about like actually conceiving of an aircraft and then all the way through to its first flight, it takes around a decade or so. The reason I mention that is that when you start that process, when you start the process of conceiving what that airplane will be and how it will live its life and out on the flying public or with the flying public, a decade from now looks likely very different from what it is right now. So we have to account for that in terms of like how we actually go about designing the aircraft. And so that's where my role comes in terms of like helping design teams understand both near and far term horizons in terms of like what's likely to happen. And I think more importantly, like what do we want to happen, right? So one of the things I talk about quite a bit is less so about like the future sort of like unfurling itself on us and happening to us where we have no agency, almost like a tidal wave. And instead to think about the future in terms of like actually as a design exercise, what is the preferred future that we want, and then how do we actually go about designing that? So that's my role in a nutshell, which is, by the way, liberates me from being wrong. because to be clear, it is absolutely impossible to predict the future. It is possible to anticipate the future, and it's even more possible to understand what's the future that we want. And that's what I tend to focus on the most.
That's the part that I love, because designing the future that we want is so important. I think, for myself, coming from an architecture background, I think that's something that architects are generally pretty good at, in the sense of, their job is to conceive of buildings in the way users are going to use the building, 5 years in the future when the building's actually done. Could be 10 years depending on the project, just like building an aircraft, like building an airport, right? Like, how is culture going to change?
Totally.
That I think, for the topic of today's conversation, when the cost of execution goes to zero, I think what we're needing to look at right now is, how do we design our own future? What is the future of the design industry? And how can we, as architects, designers, professionals in the design space, actually do that? And I think when we look at the past iterations of technology, especially with architecture in particular, with CAD, with BIM, and now AI, there has been a kind of languishing where we haven't decided those futures. They've been decided for us, right? And I think with AI, right, this is a kind of a dangerous moment now for everybody across design industries, whether it's industrial, architecture, product, where it's kind of being decided for us again. And, that's something that I want to tackle with you is, how can we kind of claim some more authority here and make sure that we have a say in our own future, and kind of back that up with our authority in designing other features. Clearly, we do the job of designing what these future products, experiences, buildings are going to be like, but we seem to have little agency in actually doing it for ourselves.
Actually, can you say a little more about that? Like in terms of like doing it for yourselves, like what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I feel like there's an unfortunate moment right now across design teams in enterprises and different industries where the design folks are the ones who are being let go. And I think part of that is they can't justify their value. They don't know basically what they're selling. And as execution becomes cheaper and cheaper with AI, what a design firm is actually selling and how designers are justifying what they do kind of needs to change, right? Like clearly the hourly billing rate and what we're actually presenting to a client and what we're asking them to buy from us is changing, right? Like deliverables are no longer the thing that clients are buying, right? So how do we kind of like reclaim our own future here, right? Where we're selling value and outcomes or reducing risks, let's say, and not just selling like a drawing set or like a series of parts to be fabricated,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one way to even, at the risk of sounding like I'm putting like an overly hopeful spin on this, when changes like AI and other sort of market disruptions occur, there is in some ways a little bit of a gift in that, to your point, like for example, when a force reveals that actually our deliverables aren't what we thought they were, there actually is some clarity in just that process, or just going through that process. I mean, that certainly has happened with brand design. I mean, the industry that I worked, previously in, the whole notion of like spending, what now looks like exorbitant sums of money on brand identity compared to like hiring out sort of like, a distributed labor workforce, online to maybe replicate some of that activity. That certainly subverted that whole marketplace. But to your point, I think one of the things I keep coming back to is that our real deliverables are on the human side. The real deliverables are on through currencies like collaboration. I mean, just to dwell for a second on AI as a sort of an agentic force here, in the mix. There's lots of things that AI has sort of already proven that it can do from a sort of lift standpoint. I've yet to ever feel like I was actually collaborating with AI. Like to feel like I was actually critiquing something, and maybe that's to your point about like the deliverable is not the sketch, the deliverable is the charrette. Right, that's the deliverable, and that's certainly that underpins our relationship with Boeing over the past 80 years. I mean, one of the phrases I sometimes use in describing that relationship, and it's an unusual phrase potentially, but the phrase I use is client intimacy. And what I mean by that is when you've worked with someone so long, and actually there's at least perceived less risk of that relationship going away, that unlocks a different type of latitude, a different type of license for the collaborators involved to be their true selves. And it's sort of the difference in a way between like being married and dating, right? Like when you're dating someone, and this is, I think, true for a lot of design firms out there. A lot of design firms spend a lot of their time doing what I would describe as dating. And when you are dating clients, you are in a pleasing mode, right? How do you continue this momentum? And that's a very, very different mode than when you have the latitude to kind of roll up your sleeves and say, I think you're really wrong. And the reason I feel comfortable saying you're really wrong is because we've worked together so long that this relationship's not going away. And by the way, it goes the other direction, that they have the latitude to say, no, I think you're wrong. I appreciate your candor, but I think you're wrong. So I think that's what, like, the whole notion of client intimacy is a good, maybe a good exemplar of that kind of the human side of things that really are our real deliverables.
Yeah, I would love to chew on that a little bit more, but it seems like, generally speaking, AEC, architecture, engineering, construction, they never built up this client intimacy in the same way that Teague and Boeing have, where most architecture firms, they get a big project, they work on it for 10 years, and then that relationship is kind of over. They have to
Right.
go now bid on something else, propose something else, find new clients, or they get referrals from that person. But I'd be curious to hear why you think maybe that industry hasn't been able to do that same thing that you're describing, where there is this partnership, this marriage, this intimacy that they produce. It seems like the client architect relationship, and maybe this is true in other design firms as well, is a little bit more adversarial, where it's it can be a little bit more like this client doesn't get it, and the client's like this
Right.
architect doesn't get it. That seems to be more common. I wonder why.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this might, we'll maybe circle around and see if there's some truth to uncover here. Like, one of the things I was always fascinated by, particularly when I was working for Fitch, which is now Landor, as I mentioned, and it was because Fitch was very much in the design, like sort of the brand design, like realm. And the reason I bring it up is like that's more similar to architecture than, say, advertising, for example. And one of the things I was always fascinated by was that brand design was often coupled with advertising, like, oh, design firms and advertising agencies have some similarities, when actually their deliverables were really quite different, and their relationships, to your point, with clients were sort of inverted, meaning that like advertising agencies appeared, at least from my vantage point, to deal primarily in short-term deliverables over long-term relationships. And similar to what you said about architectural firms, how they operate, brand design firms tended to work in long-term deliverables over short-term relationships that then went away. And so for me, I was sort of like pined for like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have that long-term relationship? And I think that's where there's maybe a lesson to be drawn here from ad agencies, is that the focus of the engagement that is somewhat transactional, but what ends up being more important is sort of a long-term view of what are we trying to accomplish decade over decade. And now, of course, advertising agencies are not immune to that. I mean, one of the things that happens is that as soon as you get a new chief marketing officer, then they often just change out the ad agency. So that doesn't, isn't it entirely as tidy as I've made it seem. But again, I think like the thing that we've always strived to do is like, what's our long-term vision for this? Yes, there's going to be some transactional things that we're going to need to accomplish from a design standpoint, just from a to-do standpoint, if you will. But that doesn't excuse us from the more important task of understanding, like, what are we, to put the bookend on it, like, yes, there's transactional stuff, but what's the transformational stuff? What's the transformational stuff that we're actually trying to accomplish, and how will that be accomplished, even iteratively, one transaction over another, one aircraft after another, one building after another, one whatever that is after another, and that just underpins a different type of relationship in terms of like the standpoint there. I wish I had a better answer in some regards in terms of like, why that is, but I think you're right. I think, if I think about like working on something that's a long-term deliverable that's executed over the short term, relatively speaking, there's something that's actually quite taxing about that process, right? So it's not unusual that people would sort of, so to speak, kind of break up after that. The trick is
that makes a
not
lot of
break up.
sense. Because it's something that's really high stress. You have to deliver it in a short period of time, short-ish, let's say, or else the client starts losing money and they get mad.
Right.
And then they have to go live with this thing that, if it was rushed, could be bad. So I could see how that could produce a relationship over the long tail that isn't beneficial, where somebody might be like, oh man, like they delivered this building, but the process of working with them, the collaboration didn't feel right.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and just to pick up on something you said that was really interesting, is that there is that sometimes this sort of tendency for us to think like, oh, well, that client didn't get it. They didn't understand something. And I would describe that as sort of like one behavior within sort of a bigger bucket of us and theming. And that's something that I think happens a lot just in design in general. There's this sort of like us and them, and there's some liminal spaces between them, but between those two things, but in a lot of ways it's overcooked, it's overpronounced. And like, as an example, by the way, like one of my favorite moments in a Teague project is when, even by the way, even just internally, like to Teague, never mind when in terms of the client involvement, but I think this is especially true when the client is involved. My favorite moment is always when the disciplines sort of fade to the background, and anyone who has been steeped in the project has license to contribute beyond their discipline. And what I mean by that is like that, you've been so intently focused on something, so intently focused on your objective that a strategist feels empowered to have an industrial design idea. An industrial designer feels empowered to have a strategic idea, and so forth. And that all of those disciplines just sort of fade away. And that's the opposite of what I would describe as that kind of us and theming. And that us and theming is a setup for a rationalization for why it didn't work. Right? Like it didn't work because this person didn't get it, or it didn't work because of this or that. But it is that kind of us and them. I mean, I think that is sometimes endemic in design processes.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think I just spoke to this firm, Shop Architects. They were telling me how they have this kind of internal tool that is like kind of like an AR or 3D app on the iPad for buildings, and they show that to the client so the client can understand like the phasing of the building and how they arrived to this idea. And they were saying that doing something like that just gives the client a feeling of so much more ownership over the idea if they can understand how this form was derived. I'd be curious to hear, at Teague, is this something that you guys do as well? Or like maybe what are some ways that folks can prevent that us and theming with clients? Because it seems like that's the really big one with, saying the clients don't get it, but maybe they just don't get how we arrived here.
Right, exactly. Well, one of the things I mean, we're going to get into some really, really blunt territory here. One of the things I think that some design disciplines can be really hooked on is this notion of going dark, what I would describe as going dark. And what I mean by that is like, I'm going to receive the brief, and then I'm going to go away to my special magic land that you, the client, are not invited to, by the way, right? So like there's this sort of like notion of proprietary process, proprietary culture, or an exclusive culture, maybe a better way to put it. And then I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to present the proverbial three directions forward. And what's really happening in that type of arrangement is, and I'm unsure if that really happens as much in the AEC industry as it does in other design disciplines. But what's really happened in that kind of working style is this really, really thrilling gamble that goes on, where it's like, I am going to hope that my perspective building is correct. And the reason I say there's a gamble is because I'm actually going to spend the client, I'm going to spend a lot of the client's money without them weighing in. And so I hope we're right. And so there is some thrill to that, but there's also a lot of exclusion built into that. So one of the things to answer your question that I think that that we really focus on is, and it was something that I had to kind of like get up to speed on, really frankly, when I first joined 15 years ago, was a couple things. One was much smaller increments of time between iterations of things, meaning that like it was like weekly sprints. Like we often trade in sort of like weekly sprints. Like this will be a 6-week program or it'll be a 6-month program, but regardless of the time frame, it's going to have weekly check-ins. And then the other one is this notion of concurrence, like letting go of sequence, like this meaning that like letting go of the idea that this person has to do their job before I can do my job. And instead, like we're all going to do our jobs together, and we're going to give each other the latitude to learn alongside each other. And not sort of hold ourselves to like, oh, well, we can't learn new stuff now because that phase is over. But across all of those practices is really sort of a much more inclusive set of mechanisms for clients to essentially maybe not even essentially, just like directly co-participate in design. I think that's, if and again, like maybe getting into like some really blunt territory, I think the notion of like creative ownership is really touchy in a lot of places. And when we let go of the notion of creative ownership, meaning that like, actually we did all these sprints and I can't even recall whose idea informed this or whose idea informed that. Instead, we were all working as a team. That's different than that sort of like more theatrical approach I mentioned earlier, where we're going to present, in this really dramatic way and hope that it works out.
Yeah, no, I've seen that a lot. It's kind of like someone kind of feels like they need to direct, and like
it's the Don Draper model, basically.
Yes, yes, like this is my idea. Everybody's
Yep.
supporting this. Client,
Yep.
you're gonna like it or you're not gonna like it. And
exactly.
if you didn't like it, you were the wrong client.
Right. And the thing that, real quickly, to touch on that a little bit further, is that the reason, one of the things that's so wrong with that approach, in my opinion, is it actually sort of misunderstands who owns that whole thing in the end anyway, which is the client, right? So like they, not only do they have a right to co-participate in the design process, there's an imperative, in my opinion, for them to co-participate, because it's them, it's theirs.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe the challenge then for architects and really designers of all industries at this point in time might be more like decoding that step of how do I cater to the client's needs without being a yes man. Like I don't want to just do everything the client says, because they're not the experts, right? And
Right.
similar to our Blair Ends conversation previously, like as the designer, you have an expertise in this particular thing. They should listen to you, because you have that authority. But I think incorporating them into that assessment and incorporating their goals, or maybe understanding their risks and their desires, and speaking to those with the design solution provided might be the ultimate challenge, where people, I think, have a hard time doing that.
Yeah, exactly. What it surfaces for me, by the way, is if you actually talk to clients about how work is I'm just dwelling really, really at a very basic level about like how work is presented to them. If you have candid conversations with clients around how work is presented to them, you'll actually uncover some actually kind of like really interesting even suspicions about how it works. Meaning, going back to like the proverbial three directions kind of model, clients will openly wonder if you ask them, "Oh, did you order these in a certain way to almost like trick me?"
Wow.
like did you sequence these in a way that is gives one direction an advantage over another? That's troubling. That type of feedback, I think, is should be a wake-up call for everyone involved in design work and everyone involved in presenting design work, because that suspicion should not be there. What should instead be there is actually like a much more trusting, kind of open posture of, yeah, we're working on this together. And to your point around like, some of our fears in the design space around like around working in certain ways. I remember having a conversation one time with a couple designers where one of them said, well, I was advocating for showing more early iterations of things versus fewer refined iterations of things. And they said one of their fears was, well, what if the client picks the wrong one? And and my sense on that was like, well, one, if we think it's wrong, it shouldn't be in the mix, period, right? But two, if it's actually more that we failed conversationally. If that happens and we are not able to describe why it isn't the right idea or there's a better idea, then it just means that going back to client intimacy, it means that we've failed at client intimacy. We've failed on that human side. Rather than some like sort of like wizardry or voodoo or tricks around like how we're presenting and what we're presenting.
Mm-hmm. That client research step is so important, and I think normally when I ask people how do you research your clients, they're like, oh, I just Google them, and like that's kind of it. But I think there's so much more, right? Like on the intimacy part, it's like, let's say if you did want to date someone, right? Like you would want to know all these different things about them and figure out if you're compatible. I think maybe that's missing from the design step, where I had this one friend at an architecture firm where they were designing a winery, a pavilion for a winery. This client had a vineyard. His wife was like the true stakeholder there. Like she actually made decisions, even though he was the client. She was super important in swaying all opinion. So they didn't really do their homework on figuring out like how important she was in the design process. And they proposed this beautiful barrel vaulted ceiling for the pavilion. And all the walls inside were curved, and it was beautiful. And they were super into it, right? They're like, "Oh my god, this is like perfect for this." We're like echoing all this wine history, stuff like that. And then she kept on saying after she saw that design, like, "I would really like to see a version that's flat, like flat ceiling, flat walls." And they were all really upset. They're like, "Oh no, why would she want to do this? This client's wrong. She has no taste. Like this is so ugly compared to what we've designed." And it was only later that they figured out that the reason why she was asking for this is because she was an art collector, and this pavilion was supposed to have all the art, all the paintings. Yep. You can't hang them on curved walls.
Yep. The unknown parameter. Yeah.
Right? And it's like, oh man. So they just like kind of got too obsessed with this design idea and didn't really research the client and figure out like what's their motivation for this pavilion, like why are they really doing it. It's not a place just to store wine and like entertain people. There's a lot of other stuff to it that's more important, obviously, now it's
right.
That supersedes their design. But so it's kind of a shame, like all this, this design work sunk in that
exactly.
It was
the thing that it brings up for me is that like we also tend to, across all design disciplines, we tend to think that we actually are a fit for everyone, and that's not true. Like we tend to think that the world is our oyster, and that that we are obviously a fit for everyone. But to use your dating analogy, if you actually went through a very candid and self-reflective exercise of understanding like who you are a fit for, you'd realize that all of us are fits for certain people and not fits for other people. And the same is true. The same is true creatively, and the same is true commercially.
Would you say that at Teague you guys have a process for that, where you try to narrow down who's the ideal client for you based upon what you guys are good at? Like, is there like a kind of like a matchmaking there process?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably imperfect, just like anyone's process. I think one of the things that we try to do, and I'll use some phraseology that to sort of illuminate this, is one of the things that we often are asking ourselves is this thing, whatever it is that comes in, is this challenge, is this design ask, whatever this is this Teague shaped? And we use the phrase Teague shaped as actually as a means of reflecting on what I just mentioned earlier, which is like, is this actually something where we can bring some goodness? Like, is this something where we actually what's unique about us would benefit this? Or is this something that isn't Teague shaped, meaning that actually someone else would do this much better, and the client would be better served by going with that person? So I would say, we are imperfect, just like lots and lots of organizations. Every organization has its own pathologies. I think one of the ways that we, to pat ourselves up on the back a little bit, is that we are actually very comfortable letting go of things that are not Teague shaped, where we would say, hey, thanks for asking. We're flattered to be involved and thought of. And upon reflection, we think that actually you'd be better served going somewhere else. So I think that's something that we actually do engage in. Now, of course, just like anyone else, there's times where we'll think to ourselves, well, it's kind of Teague shaped, and maybe we kind of really do want to do this, and then we'll lean on it that way. But I think that having that kind of mechanism for self-reflection has been important to us. Because it also helps us understand like what motivates us, and again, like how we can actually add value and how we can't add value.
Wow, yeah, it's a really great exercise. I wonder how many folks are able to do that successfully, because I think I talk to a lot of firms, and a lot of them just pitch for everything. They can't help themselves. They see the opportunities there, and they're like, "Oh, it'd be great to have a hospital project in the portfolio." But it's like, you've never done a hospital. Like, why are you pitching this?
Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I mean, that notion of like narrow expertise, I think, is a tricky one for designers in particular to maneuver, because I think we kind of want to like design a bunch of different things typically, versus like completely specialize. At the same time, like when you completely specialize, you actually have some unique superpowers that are really replicable. So there's obviously a balancing act there for sure. I mean, one of the things that we also go through is like, there's a number of verticals that we're really, really strong in, and they can appear to be divergent at first blush if you're just to look at them. But if you sort of peel away the onion layers a bit more, you realize like, oh, actually, there's a lot of similar things. When you engage in, like, for example, like designing an aircraft cabin that is also portable to designing a space station, right? Because you're dealing with small spaces that are in motion and so forth. So even though those things can feel like very far apart, they're actually a lot closer than sometimes they first appear. And that's something that we go through as well. Like, what are some ways in which our expertise kind of plays across domains in a way that helps them kind of helps us learn across all of them.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. I mean, you guys do a lot of kind of like transportation or transit design in general, right? And I guess that stems from aircraft.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have a big background in aviation. We also have a big background in consumer electronics and technology in general. I mean, sometimes the way I will describe it to some people, and this is a really, really clumsy way of describing it, so apologies, but if you remember the books that we grew up with as kids, were sometimes like, when you were really young, you'd have a book where you'd take the head of one animal and the midsection of another animal and the tail of another animal.
Oh, yeah.
You'd flip the book, right? It's like a flip book. And that's true for us in the sense that, like, in broad, really, really broad brushstrokes, you could take emerging technologies like autonomy, like artificial intelligence, whatever that emerging technology is, and then you combine it with either a modality, to your point, like a transportation thing, or some sort of like human activity. So lots of our programs involve the combination of emerging tech plus whatever that other thing is.
I bet that makes it also easier to sell an idea, right? Where it's kind of like, you're combining, let's say, 3 different disciplines within your firm's capabilities into a client. They're like, oh wow, they're experts at like these 3 different things, and they're giving me a combination of them that no other firm is like really capable of even maybe presenting to me, but almost certainly not capable of delivering.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something we started noticing, probably 10 years ago, at least, probably even more than that, actually, was that most of those programs that I mentioned that are Teague shaped really cannot be accomplished through a single discipline. So we almost never do a project that is just involves, for example, just involves industrial design. Almost all of our programs involve industrial design plus interaction design plus engineering. There's almost always 3, 4, 5 different disciplines in the mix, and that's increasingly what sort of is Teague shaped, solving for like really, really tough complexity, like really, really wrestling with complexity and trying to create some clarity from that complexity through design processes.
So interesting. I can definitely see your brand experience like in the DNA of Teague after 15 years, because this is like a lot of positioning. Like what is Teague shaped, right? Like,
right.
We're going to play in these categories, but then also branding. Like, how are people going to think of Teague? Like, Teague is technologically advanced. We have high design, and we're interactive. Like we move you around. We're not just some static thing. So, like, if people, I'm sure Teague just like naturally surfaces for people who have those 3 needs, right? So that kind of probably plays into maybe how you qualify these pursuits of like, does it meet our 3 pillars, right?
Right.
And then
yeah, true. Yeah.
That kind of probably leads also into the 3 directions later, right? Where if the client doesn't have to question, are they sequencing this in a certain way? Kind of like, we know these are what these people specialize in, so it gives us more trust in the relationship and what we're being shown.
One of the things that we really struggle with, to talk about something that we struggle with, one of the things we struggle with is we oftentimes the programs we're working on, we just can't talk about them. Like, we're so constrained by NDAs that from a marketing standpoint, sometimes we end up being a little bit of a best kept secret because we simply just can't talk about the things we're doing from a marketing standpoint. So which is one of the reasons why periodically we engage in concept projects, and one of the reasons we do concept projects is just to flex muscles in ways that we own. So like, hey, we did this thing, this is a concept project, we can talk about it because it's ours. But yeah, that actually is one of our bigger problems, is from a marketing and PR standpoint, we're just constrained quite a bit from client.
Oh wow, okay, that's super interesting. I wonder, in architecture they must have this problem as well, but usually it's during the period of building, which takes forever. But the final thing, people everybody
Everybody talks about it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Unless it's
exactly.
like, an embassy or something,
It's
or like something
true.
hidden, like a bunker. But
Yeah. Well, some clients of ours, like we, our rule with like, that like our rule with Boeing is that we can talk about it once it's flying. But to our discussion earlier, that can take 10, 15 years. And some of our clients, we can't talk about it ever. So
how do you keep
there's some things.
Boeing happy for 10, 15 years, like for an aircraft? Because there's got to be so many points where they're like, man, this is just not it. This is not what we were envisioning. Like, I imagine that's hard even with like the weekly sprints where things could end up in a direction that they hadn't originally imagined. Like, how do
Sure.
you maintain that? How do you maintain a marriage?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, I think that, the human part of it, and obviously the specter of AI, and you brought it up as well, like, the specter of AI is kind of like, hanging over us in terms of like what will AI take away from us as designers? What will it take away from us as practitioners in this space? But I do think it kind of it continues to come back to like those human skills, right? It's actually the act of like just of getting along, the act of like, earnestly and passionately sharing your perspectives, but in a way that is within that successful relationship. There's some shorthand too, by the way. Like that's the other thing that I think comes from. It's one of the joys of like working with the same client over and over again. Is what emerges from that is a shorthand and a rhythm for how this all works, and that can be really, really affirming. And it still leaves room for like those like groundbreaking gestures, those groundbreaking moments when when everyone involved realizes, oh, there's actually another way forward here. But yeah, I mean, I wish it was more secret saucy than that, but it's really just about like kind of the human side of things.
Is it tough then when folks change on either side? Like people from Teague leave or someone from Boeing leaves?
Well, it was one of the things I noticed, by the way, when I first joined Teague back in 2011. It was when I was doing like initial tours around our various studios, because we have a number of studios, one of which or several of which are embedded inside Boeing. And coming from more of the brand design side, this was very unusual to me. But I would meet people who had been at Teague for literally 30 plus years, and I thought, what is happening here? Like this is astonishing. But I think that's the other part of it, like the sort of like the joys of having like transformational relationships over the long haul tend to be really, really, really rewarding to people. And so I think our retention, I'd be curious to sort of measure this against other firms, but I think our retention tends to be pretty extraordinary because of that, I think. And also culture, right? I mean, to answer your question, I mean, of course, it's difficult when people leave, and difficult when you lose that institutional know-how. But it also points out, when people stay, why culture is so important, why. And why that, again, that client intimacy, that kind of model of like working together in a really, really close way is so important from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah,
Like
no.
to be clear about it, that does come at a cost, right? Like there's a cost to that, meaning that like if you're so steeped in long-term transformational relationships, the idea of like something more transactional, however sexy it is, can mean that we actually aren't as good of a fit for that.
Wow, yeah, that's true. It's interesting with Boeing as well, because in architecture, most of their clients are developers, real estate developers, and real estate developers, they don't have the succession planning and like longevity that's a company like Boeing has. So maybe it's also something along those lines as well, where as you age, you might have a long time client, but something like COVID happens, or your client just retires, and all of a sudden you're like, well, man, this person who gave me 70% of my business is now gone for XYZ reason. And
Right.
they're not an enterprise like Boeing that just will live forever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'd say about that is that I think this is, for me as a strategist, I mean, I'm a futurist, but a futurist is a version of a strategist, and it's within that realm. One of the things I feel like often occurs across categories is that people confuse their mission for their vision. And what I mean by that is they think the business that they're in today is their vision, and that's not their vision. So to use I put this in an example form, like sometimes I'll run into like an airline, for example, that thinks that their their mission is to operate aircraft, right? When really their mission should be to connect people to the people, places, and things that matter to them around the world. And that would actually that would liberate them to do that in ways that also actually go beyond aircraft. So, but sometimes, like, so to your point about a developer, like you think your mission is to like develop properties, but your mission is actually something at a higher order than that. And if there was fluency about what that higher order is, it would actually help anchor them across the decades. It would help anchor their perspective around like why they do what they do from one decade to another versus like, oh yeah, well, we develop properties.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a mindset that some folks have. Like there are story developers who've been around forever and they're huge. But yeah, I would say that doesn't seem to be a vast majority. And I guess it's tough to do something like that, especially with every round of succession is like a chance for failure, right? So that's also a tough one, even for architecture firms, right? Where it's like you want to leave your firm in a good place, you want to have your principals underneath your partners like be able to succeed you. And I think we're coming to an interesting time where like a lot of architects and architecture firms or architecture firms in general are like kind of going through this period where the firm owner, the founder is like starting to retire or has retired and getting the next generation of leaders up and running. Even at design studios like Nendo, it's like a big deal that Sato is leaving, right? And how do you plan for that? So I'd be curious to hear, what do you think comes next? Like what's the future look like for a design firm in, let's say, 2032, just 5 years from now? And what do you think the new principals, the new generation of people who are starting to be considered for these roles, maybe they're transitioning, maybe they're thinking about it, like what do you think that they should do? And for folks in the chat, feel free to throw any comments or questions up in here and we'll answer them as we go along.
One of the things that when I worked for Fitch, that it was always sort of a little bit unnerving was it was owned by one of the large holding companies. I don't even need to name them by name, but there's 3 of them in the world, and they tended to look at design firms and other firms that are adjacent to design firms through the lens of, well, there's a certain amount of spend that's happening in the world in this category, and the way to grow is to acquire that spend. And the reason I mention that is that that would be their guide in terms of like why they would purchase design firms. It's to the question around like what's the future of design firms in a lot of ways. And so, one route is acquisition. You're acquired by someone. But one of the things that was always sort of vexing to me from the acquirer's perspective was they didn't actually seem to understand what we just actually spent quite a bit of time talking about, which is the human side of things. And so when employees or clients were to leave post acquisition, they just basically acquired a lease. They just acquired a building that they owe money on, and they acquired desks and chairs and computers, and that's it. But that's not what they were after. That's not actually why they were seeking to acquire the firm. They were trying to acquire the spend that was occurring. So in broad brushstrokes, it feels like, like at least from like to pick up on where you're going with the sort of the trajectory of existing firms before we talk about like the future of new firms. Like one of them is like, are you going to be acquired, or are you going to do go some other route? And I feel like the more fruitful way forward that's sort of bearing out more and more, and this has certainly happened in our category, is how do you transition the firm to be employee owned? How do you transition the firm to resist the specter of acquisition and all the culture loss that comes with that, and instead preserve the culture, preserve the thing that's actually vaulted you to where you are through continued employee ownership? And so that's the mechanism that feels like the most fruitful way forward to me, at least, having compared what I've seen occurring in the marketplace. I mean, we have, friends and foes and colleagues in the industrial design space that have, all gone away because of, because of the former. So,
Wow. It's interesting because there have been a couple acquisitions in the AEC space recently, and typically it seems like it's a bigger construction engineering firm like enterprise that wants to
mm,
acquire either specialized studios who are good at a particular thing, like let's say they're an arts fabricator and they do like high-end art production, that becomes like a differentiator they can add to their capabilities. Or it's like an architecture firm that's like a couple hundred people who have more of that kind of, let's say, cloud-based projects or design sensibility that the engineering firm simply doesn't have, and then they become kind of like a couple of one being able to propose a design that's sexy,
sure.
attracts people, they have that name brand recognition, and then the engineering firm can basically be the consultant on the project and get the big bucks and have more of an uh, integrated relationship there. But I guess I'm not sure how that acquisition ownership typically works out, because I would imagine if you're an architecture firm getting acquired by a larger engineering firm, you're kind of at their mercy. Like, you have to use their systems now, right? Like, now you're following
Exactly.
Microsoft Teams,
Right. Yeah. That
use
goes back to the culture issue. Like, it goes back to a culture problem. But just, by the way, not to say that it can't work, because I think like the scenario you brought up, like actually on paper, there's lots of things that make sense about that. So, and I'm sure there are successful iterations of that. But yeah, I think if I had to, bet, I would say that I would bet more on the notion of employee ownership versus.
When you talk about employee ownership, Devin, are you talking more about like partners buying their stake in the company, or everybody having
Yeah,
equity?
I'm talking about more about. I mean, I think partners having their stakes is one thing. I think the other way is to like make every employee an owner, right? Like through an employee stock ownership plan. And this is certainly common in the AEC space. I know, like, my brother, formerly worked for Black and Beach, and that was an ESOP as well. And a super, super large global engineering firm. So it's not uncommon in that space. I think the reason I evangelize it a bit is that it converts everyone into a different kind of stakeholder. It goes back, actually, I mean, to go back to some of the red threads we're pulling on here. It goes back to, how do you turn a person, an employee, at every level, into someone who acts like a steward of the company rather than an employee of the company. And that's a different proposition with a different goodness than if you are an employee and the principal above you, owns it, but you don't. I think that's different.
That's so interesting. There's like a notion in AC where they kind of tell folks like, everybody here does BD. Like, even though they might have like a BizDev director, but kind of the idea is like, you should be advocating for the firm and like, basically helping us get work in any way that you can. Doesn't matter if you're, a CAD person drafting details or your partner. Like, there's this idea like everybody should be helping us, grow. But to your point, if they actually had equity, then that's built in, right? Like, that pride is built in. There is you got skin in the game, right? Like, every new project and good decision comes back to you in the form of dividends or just, the life of the studio improving. But, if you don't have that, then I could see why people might just want to leave and go somewhere else, unless the culture is particularly good.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I know, I mean, I recognize that that's one take on this, and there's certainly ways. I mean, I can see this, Ronnie Wright brings this up in the chat around, like, there are some other motivations. If you've owned a firm for a long, long time and you build it up from nothing, should you be allowed to sell out, so to speak, so, be acquired by someone else and get your payday? It's hard to begrudge that, right? I would just openly wonder, like, what happens to the firm thereafter. It just seems like there are a lot of cautionary tales around that not ending as anticipated.
It might be worse, yeah, for sure. And shout out to Ronnie. I love Ronnie. Ronnie is a former VP at Nike and Adidas, but he's also was a speaker on this show.
Right. Yes, I watched that one. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, uniting design and BizDev at Nike. But Ronnie was saying, love that thought, invite people into ownership. is the desire to be bought out in this industry. It seems a little less personal. So I think this is kind of what you were saying, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, and Ronnie would speak to this better than I can, but going back to like what we were talking about in terms of like culture, like our phrase around Teague shaped, pales in comparison to like we've collaborated with Nike quite a bit as well. And whenever I've been on the Nike campus, one of the things that always takes me back in a really, really joyful way, to be totally honest, is the way language is used on the Nike campus. You'll actually hear people say things, and you're like, "I can't believe you just said that." I thought that was almost like a tagline type thing. Like I remember being on campus one time, and for the first time hearing someone say, "Well, if you have a body, you're an athlete." It's like internally, I'm like, "Did you actually really just say that?" But it's part. It's part.
That was the plants. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it just shows you like the power of culture, right? The power of like a really, really cogent, coherent culture that knows exactly why it exists and knows exactly what it is here to do on Earth, really, and why it does what it does. So I think that kind of clarity is irreplaceable.
No, I love that. I think a lot of architecture firms, they aspire to a certain level of culture, but that culture usually is around like their design ethos of like, we believe in sustainable materials,
Sure.
We want to, be advocates for the public good. But then I think where they might have a hard time is internalizing the things that they value themselves in their own businesses. Like in architecture in particular, like burnout is super high. I think over 80% of folks in the industry have experienced burnout at least once. Late night culture is like designed in studio, and it trickles into the office where like working for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week is common. So I think maybe that's something, even in the very beginnings of schooling, like you have to kind of fix and learn and like make sure that doesn't make its way over there. I think there's probably very few studios who only work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, maybe get a half day, on Fridays or something. Like that's few and far between probably.
We have I know there's a great question coming in the chat here. So before we get to that though, I would just mention real quickly to that point, we have an annual all hands meeting. And years ago, there was a project manager who shared with me this fantastic piece of feedback, which was, at the time we were celebrating projects at this all hands meeting. And one of the things that we were inadvertently doing was, it seemed like we were highlighting programs where, to your point, we kind of had to go above and beyond. Like, here's this program where we had to like, stay around the, work around the clock, or whatever the thing that kind of like required this Herculean effort. And this program manager said to me as an aside, like, that's actually not a great thing to celebrate. We should actually be celebrating the programs that actually go to plan. Like they go the way they're supposed to go, not the ones that go sideways and require some extraordinary effort to accomplish. Like we're inverting that unnecessarily and through the lens of like, heroic action. I thought this was like an awesome piece of feedback. So.
Oh man, that really resonates with me, because my old firm was like did that a lot inadvertently, where they would glorify the person who like, stayed up late and suffered for the project but got it done.
Exactly.
And it's like, maybe we should just not do that. Go after things that we know we can complete. They feel good. But Laurent has a great question here. Love the idea of multidisciplinary design mentioned earlier, Devin. I wonder how much AI is now part of the process development at Teague.
Yeah, great question. And I mean, just probably like everyone else in the design world, we're having to sort of, make our way through this new reality. And I think the phase that we're in right now is essentially sort of an experimentation phase, like understanding, like, experimenting and tinkering with like, what can AI do for us, and what can it not do for us, and what should it not do for us. So I think that's kind of where we are. I mean, the notion of how it plays multidisciplinary and sort of an interdisciplinary way as well is a really interesting kind of angle on that question, because one of the things I think it points out is, I actually think it's probably, and I'll put this in like really broad brushstrokes, it's more important for teams together to collaboratively and coherently together experiment with how AI can serve the project's needs, rather than individual contributors or individuals within those teams sort of running rogue and using AI in ways that serve their interests. And there's a couple reasons I think that we shouldn't be doing the latter and we should be doing the former. But one of them is like, the big one to me is there's two big ones. One is mitigating risk. I think one of the things that we're probably not fully grokking at the moment is the risks that AI pose to our eventual deliverables. Meaning, like, I don't actually get the sense from what I've experimented with, and I have experimented quite extensively, there's plenty of reasons from my vantage point to give me pause for really, really trusting AI as a generative part of deliverables. And that's a segue to the second part, which is that I feel like AI should fundamentally, when it comes to design processes, be involved in sort of an augmentative way, if that makes sense. Like, not involved in the direct production or direct generation of deliverables, but instead involved in sort of in a way that augments what we're already doing. An example of that, by the way, is like, I would only show an AI generated sketch if, one, that was actually part of the program from the jump, including total transparency with the client. Like, we actually had this occur with a program a couple of years ago where we said, hey, the program you're asking for is really, really time constrained. To accomplish that, we are going to lean on AI to do some generative image development. But we're telling you that from the beginning, that's what's going to happen. And even still, the generative image development was just sort of like serving bigger ideas that were the real deliverables. Those are the real deliverables, not the sort of, those sketches weren't not the end deliverable, if that makes sense. That's a blurry spectrum, of course, between augmentative and directly involved in production, there's some overlap in there somewhere, and that's what we're all having to maneuver. But I love the prompt around like how it works, from a multidisciplinary standpoint or an interdisciplinary standpoint, because I do think that the teams should be focusing on like, how do I bring an AI, what I would describe as like an AI assisted workflow, into the program in a way that, as I said, mitigates risk, but also fundamentally like augments what we'd already be doing. Lets us do things faster, more efficiently, and so forth. But doesn't fundamentally change sort of the calculus of how we're thinking of the program from in other ways, how we would think about the program pre-AI.
I think the danger with AI is more, at least that I'm kind of imagining, is more from the client side, where there seems to be now an expectation that the deliverables can happen faster and be cheaper, and the clients are now like, because I mean they're seeing all this marketing, right? So they're kind of like, well, why can't I just use AI? Clearly, the firm is not doing the work that I want them to be doing. It's not like the exact details that I want. Like, what's stopping me now from doing it myself, or like going to a firm who says, hey, we can do it for half the price and half the time?
Sure. I mean, I think that's there. I mean, and I think I don't actually have a huge problem sort of breathing that in, if you will, because I think, this might be like, potentially adventurous take on the future of AI, because I think the future of AI could be truly transformative. In
You're very
ways that
positive
are,
about it.
well, I mean, I was going to pause there to say, like, there's also some real dystopian possibilities around AI as well. But like, just to kind of like be a little bit more, sober and rational about it, at least from the near term standpoint, I do think that there might, and I'm borrowing this from a colleague, but I just really agree with it. I think there is a scenario where 5 years hence, we actually look at kind of our hand wringing about AI presently, and come to the realization that really what's happened is AI has sort of just become indistinguishable from computational power. And what I mean by that is like, was the advent of word processing disruptive, and also like, let us do things in ways that we couldn't previously do with a typewriter? Absolutely. But it's not as if like we talk about the world having been transformed through word processing, right? I mean, that just, it's just sort of a quiver that we added to our, or an arrow that we added to our quiver. And I think that might be something that's similar when it comes to how we're using AI within design processes. The other one, just real quickly, and we can keep riffing on this, is that we shouldn't forget that AI, while it can be really, really novel in terms of like offering up new and frankly like new and unencumbered ways forward that we wouldn't otherwise think of, fundamentally, from just a technological standpoint, since it relies on pattern recognition, AI is principally backward looking. It's
Mm,
not forward looking.
right.
So while we can use it to break new ground, it itself in some ways can't break new ground on its own because it's always looking backward from a data standpoint, always looking backward from a pattern recognition standpoint. That's why the notion of the prompt has become so important. And the notion of the prompt, I think in some ways, the thing that doesn't get enough airplay around how we're using AI is actually how we are becoming more precise in our language around prompts. Everyone's had the experience of like, oh, I need this, and then it gives you something, and you're like, well, that's not what I asked for, and let me refine my prompt. And then, but the whole act of refining your prompt is an act of precision. It's an act of generating clarity that wasn't in the previous prompt and wasn't in the previous prompt to that. So there's something that's actually where AI is actually making us better at humaning.
So Laurent, another comment. AI content developed by clients is as much as saying my brother-in-law can do logos. The key is really important to creative read. Lost art nowadays and details the original term for prompt. I think that he's just hitting the nail on the head, man. I completely agree.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. And, Chris, like the flip response to like, the client who says, well, my brother-in-law can do logos is of course, like, you should have him do it then. Like if that's the case, then he should do that. But yeah, no, I totally hear that as well. I think that's where AI is probably particularly disruptive, is disruptive in kind of like, for lack of a better way of describing, like kind of like entry level positions who would have previously kind of like really toiled with a lot of that pattern recognition. And from having toiled in that pattern recognition activities, like when I first started as a brand strategist, out of college, like I did a lot of competitive auditing. And that just involved just a lot of toiling in terms of understanding what competitors are up to. That toiling made me better as a strategist, right? So that's one of my big worries, of course, and I'm sure it's the big worries of a lot of other people, is what happens when we take those tasks away from humans, and then we somehow expect to sort of like jump ahead and just have that capacity available to us. Because if that's true, where will those new experts come from if they have not toiled?
Right. How do they learn what good looks like? If we remove that step and we're like, okay, now you have to prompt something, and like even refining the prompt or like looking at the output, you're not going to really know what's good or what isn't if you haven't gone through the toiling. So maybe this is where, folks like ourselves who do have, multiple decades of experience, we have an easier time because we're like, okay, we know how to use this better. Clearly with Teague, you figure out how to use this with teams. That's these younger folks, unfortunately, we're kind of leaving them in the dust where they don't know what good looks like yet. So this is maybe another important lesson where if you are, someone young in the chat and you're thinking about adopting these tools, like having to figure out, what it looks like. And I think also if you're a new principal, like at an architecture firm or something where you're now learning how to do business after honing your craft and design for decades, right? You're learning this new thing. It might be difficult to know what does good look like, or what do I even do without some training or succession planning there. But I think we're getting we're past time here because we just love talking, man. Like it's always such a pleasure, Devin.
Well, thanks for having me.
You always inspire me with the things that you've imagined or have analyzed and seen happening. You have access to so many great rooms and folks that that I don't. But it's always great for me to hear what you think is going to be big, and I think for folks listening as well, and being able to understand what is the world going to look like for us in 5 to 10 years, and how can we as designers understand that and incorporate that better. So thank you so much, Devin. And are there any closing remarks you want to give? Like maybe just one bit of advice for folks listening, like what you think that they should do?
Oh, it's a good one. I should have one ready to go. I mean, one of the things I just like, as a capper for our conversation, is that I think that if you look back, and I love, by the way, that the liberal arts are having a renaissance in terms of like, people want, or they're shining a light on liberal arts education again, partly because of what's happened with AI. And, but I look back on like, my beginnings as a student in literature. if you reread Chaucer, which I'm not saying anyone should go out and do right now, but it's summertime, so you're probably not a lot of summer reading lists Chaucer. But if you read Chaucer, one of the things you take away is that we've actually always thought that we're going to hell in a handbasket. We've always thought that. It's actually one of our perpetual behaviors, is that we always think that what's coming around the corner is the thing that's going to kill us. And what we have always done is actually be really resilient in the face of all those things. So I would just encourage everyone to be to breathe that in as well, like that we actually are remarkably resilient, and we're really good at sorting it out. And so I have total confidence in all of our abilities to sort this out.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing ending note. Thank you so much, Devin. I think that'll make everybody feel better. So yeah, everybody, it doesn't matter. Like, we're gonna figure it out. Just go out and play.
Yeah.
Experiment with AI. Have fun. Don't think about it too hard.
Exactly. There'll be some pain, but we'll just. All right. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. And thank you all